Hello, friends. We're on to chapter 15 today, Gathering Herbs. Alice Flodo left behind all the foodstuffs she had brought: honey, jam, canned goods, fresh fruits and vegetables. "I know you three can certainly use these things up here," she said, "and you've been all so good to me." After warm goodbyes, the two cars headed out of the canyon and down the mountain for Carlin. Rolling Thunder and Alice were in the Red Falcon, and Spotted Eagle followed it in Rolling Thunder's red and black Camaro. Ann Haberton, Richard Clemmer, and I were alone again in the canyon. A beautiful peace settled in with the twilight as we prepared the evening's campfire. As we were finishing supper, we heard a car coming up the mountain road. It was dark, and we caught glimpses of headlight beams flashing in the sky as the car rounded the bends. We soon recognized the Camaro, and when it pulled up into camp, Spotted Eagle got out. He had come to get me. "Dad and Alice are going to the hot springs tonight, and Dad thought you might like to join them. I'm supposed to come get you if you want to go." "You mean Alice didn't leave?" "No, she's going to start out in the morning. Dad thought she should go to the hot springs once more before she leaves, and tonight's a good night." "Yeah, I'll go," I said. We sat in the steaming water staring silently into the night, and time stood still as it had before. Rolling Thunder and Alice and I had walked without words across the dark field, left our clothes on the bank and slid quietly into the water. Then Rolling Thunder had broken the silence only to say, "Alice, get over here this way where it's deep, and get all the way up into the water, up to your neck. Find a good warm spot and stay there." This was another very clear night, and I thought I could see every star. Some of them seemed to change colors, from green to blue to red, and back to green again. This special medicine stream had captured me. Only on this second visit, my body and my thoughts stopped almost immediately, and my mind reached out past the stars. I recognized my condition as the fresh, free feeling of transcending motion. Transcending the multitude of body feelings and nerve responses and the constant firing of impulses in the brain. All the busy, redundant thoughts of work and play and worry of the ordinary day. This transcending feeling of motion is not a stoned feeling. It's a feeling of wakefulness. The preliminary steps of meditation could be reached swiftly in this setting. Swami Rama used to say, at the beginning of his sessions, "Withdraw the senses, withdraw the senses." Perhaps the elements which were supposed to be purifying agents help to withdraw the senses. The clear, calm night, the countless stars, the quiet fields that stretch to the mountains, this stream, with its warm, muddy bottom that grasps the body, the pulling heat of the mud and water, the chemicals, the strong mineral smells that filled the head, all these combined to produce a powerful change. I was both still and alert for a long while. I was not aware of time, but then a worldly thought suddenly took part of my attention. Either I would be going to San Francisco in the morning, or Rolling Thunder would go, and I would be left behind. "This is no time for such thoughts," I told myself. Then I was aware of a strong phenomenon that I knew I had experienced before. In observing myself, I saw not one single person, but several individuals, a number of separate wills. One said urgently, "Oh, that's right. I do have to see about going to San Francisco. I almost forgot." Another, somewhat wiser and more calm, quietly said, "Be still. Pay attention to the purification. This is no time to think such thoughts." After a pause, it began again. "There will be an opportunity to talk of going to San Francisco after this. Be quiet until then. If you persist, I will ignore you until you go away." Still another observed, "You are also going on and on." A fourth looked down, saying and thinking nothing, merely watching as one watches children at play. A fifth was totally aware of the fields and mountains and stars. When Rolling Thunder crawled out of the steaming water, Alice and I followed. We stayed for a long while on the bank, keeping the silence. This night had an Indian summer feeling, and there's no better way to experience such a night than to lie naked on the bank of a medicine spring in a quiet meadow under the stars, still and silent, drying in the gentle wind. I thought I would like to stay here for hours. Rolling Thunder walked back to where we had left our clothes. Back in everyday consciousness, I followed. I felt invigorated, but I also wanted to go to San Francisco with Rolling Thunder. There seemed little chance left to mention it. Riding down the mountain, I had thought this might be a chance to talk to him about the coming week. Now was the time, but I could hardly destroy the silence. It was a silence that made every sentence I prepared in my mind seem too abrupt to say aloud. How could I speak when no one was talking here this night? We were about to leave. Then a brief exchange between Rolling Thunder and Alice about an extra towel broke the silence, and I was able to at last begin. Rolling Thunder, Immediately he interrupted. "Well, I thought you might just come right along with us. Spotted Eagle can come for you in the morning." "Okay, fine." Everything was perfectly arranged in less than 10 seconds. I had carried out an internal conversation in the stream, and Rolling Thunder had apparently heard. In the morning, I woke before sunrise. I had slept very little. Even so, I felt rested. I dressed and washed and packed things I would take to San Francisco. I had been using Rolling Thunder's sleeping bag, so I rolled it up to return it. I planned to get another in San Francisco. I waited for Spotted Eagle to come. It was a long wait. Anne and Richard got up, and we ate breakfast together. The sun moved over the length of the canyon, rising high above the cliff walls at the far end, then over our heads and towards the rolling, grassy hills. We ate lunch. I lay on a mattress, looking up through the branches of a tall tree at the passing clouds until my eyes closed. I was sleeping when the Camaro drove up into camp. It was mid-afternoon. I put the things in the car, and we went quickly on our way down the mountain. Spotted Eagle told me he was sorry he had not come for me as arranged. His father had gotten up late and was in great pain with a toothache or something. Spotted Eagle doubted we would get on our way until very late tonight. I wasn't really surprised or upset by the delay. I had learned that with Rolling Thunder, there were no delays, only the right time for everything. Richard Clemmer had remarked as we were eating lunch how Rolling Thunder always seemed to move as the spirit moves him. It had been long enough to know that this was true. What did surprise me was that Rolling Thunder was in pain. It was somehow difficult to conceive of Rolling Thunder suffering from an ordinary toothache. For the past several days I had been bothered by sneezing, or worse, by not sneezing and needing to, and by itchy, watery eyes. While I was waiting this morning, I had decided to speak to Rolling Thunder about my discomfort. Now I changed my mind. I couldn't mention my own condition if he was in pain. We reached Carlin in less than half an hour, and Brandy, the St. Bernard, gave his usual greeting of flopping his tail in the dust of Rolling Thunder's yard. The easiest way to get through the front door was to step right over this sad-eyed and drooling dog who spent most of his days on the doorstep. Rolling Thunder and Spotted Fawn were there, sitting in their chairs. Spotted Fawn got up to bring me a cup of coffee as soon as we were inside. She always had a large pot of hot coffee in the kitchen, and more likely than not, a large pot of chicken or beef stew keeping warm on the stove. Spotted Fawn was always feeding people as though it was a part of her life. There was something about her way that made it a pleasure to receive even from a cup of coffee from her. Rolling Thunder and I were talking when he had mentioned he was having great pain. I had almost forgotten about the toothache. There was no sign about him at all that indicated pain, other than his saying so. This is a subject that interests me a lot, Rolling Thunder said, apparently meaning the subject of pain. These things are the price we have to pay, sometimes. Nothing comes for free. It's my choice, and sometimes I have to pay heavy. He was not being explicit, and so I imagined him having accomplished a healing or having a confrontation, a contest of will, with what he might have called negative forces. I did not ask. I felt this was not an area for questions. What Rolling Thunder wanted me to hear was not the private details of the event, but the essence of the rule. He watched me for a moment, and then repeated, "Nothing comes for free. Everything has its cost." "I'm also interested in how to handle these things," he went on. "Every case of sickness and pain has its reason, and it's always a price that's being paid, either for something past or something future. But that doesn't mean we're not supposed to do something about sickness and pain. The important thing is to know how these things work. Modern doctors, most of them, don't seem to understand these things. A medicine man's job is to look into these things. We know that everything is the result of something and the cause of something else, and it goes on like a chain. You can't just make the whole chain go away. Sometimes a certain sickness or pain is meant to be because it's the best possible price for something. You make that go away, and the price becomes greater. The person himself may not know that, but his spirit knows it. That's why when sometimes we take up to 3 days to look into things before we take a case, and we may not take it at all. He paused for a moment, looked around, and then he called for Spotted Eagle. There was no answer. Physical troubles have all kinds of reasons, good or bad. We might call them, but they all start on a spiritual level. An infection might be called a spiritual impurity. What happens in the body is not the main thing, so healing requires knowing more than the body. If a modern MD sees a sick man, he sees the sickness and not the man. If the doctor doesn't understand what's going on, what the problem really is, if he then gives some chemicals so the person won't feel anything, or if he finds some troubled part of the body and cuts it off and throws it in the trash, it's probably all unnecessary, and it certainly isn't healing. Anyway, I'm very interested in pain and in relieving pain when it can be done by natural means. There are different spiritual conditions. Every physical thing in nature is a spiritual thing in spiritual nature, so these things can be spiritual helpers. There are ways to find these things and to understand what they are, and not just by the chemical composition. I can take a certain plant, for example, even one I have never seen before, and I can hold it in my hand and understand it. Again he looked around and called even louder, "Mala!" Spotted Eagle came. "Go get some empty cartons from my herb cellar and some knives and put them in my car." Then he turned to me. "Thought we might go into the hills just a few miles east of here and bring back some good medicine." "Good," I said. We headed east on the main highway and drove for about 15 minutes before Spotted Eagle pulled over and parked his car off of the road as far as he could. The three of us started up the hill with our boxes and cutting tools. "Now we don't want to hurt any snakes, so be careful not to step on any." Rolling Thunder had said, "In the Nevada desert country, things somehow appear closer than they really are. so it seemed that we walked for a long time before rolling thunder stopped. We were in the midst of tall, leafy, bristly-looking plants that were growing quite thickly in this spot. Rolling Thunder looked at them. Some he squinted at and touched. Was he inspecting them for quality? Finally, he walked up to a group of these plants, looked at them for a moment, then turned his back on them and looked up at the sky. He took something from his pocket and held it near his face in a half-closed fist while his lips began to move. I wondered whether it was all right to watch. I turned my head away. Spotted Eagle was not watching. He seemed to be staring into space. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Rolling Thunder turn and hold the unknown substance to the sun. Then he turned again. Now he was facing the group of plants. I watched him stoop to shake his hand under one of the plants, but I didn't try to see what he placed there. He turned toward Spotted Eagle and pointed up the hill, making a sweeping motion with his hand. Spotted Eagle looked at his father, blinked, and nodded his head. Rolling Thunder faced me and pointed to the plant behind him. He smiled and spoke in a whisper, so that I had to think for a minute before I heard the words. "This one's the chief." Somehow our work was carried out without words. I acquired the job of carrying small armloads of the plant and dropping them over a barbed wire cattle fence we had crawled under halfway up the hill. Each time I walked down the hill and up, I passed that special plant. I looked at it, knowing that it was the chief. Even though I knew this, I did not know what it meant. Was the plant itself different from the others? Had something different attached itself to the plant? I wondered whether the plants, particularly this chief, were aware of us. I felt they were, but I did not know what that awareness was. Someone had once said to me, "All this life is conscious, but it is not conscious of being conscious." I did not know in what sense these plants were conscious, but life inside them was like, or what that life would feel to me if I could observe it. My wish to know increased each time I passed the chief. About an hour or so had elapsed when we crawled back under the barbed wire fence, stuffed the plants into the boxes, and walked back to the car. It had been a beautiful hour spent in silence on that sunny hill. Once again with Rolling Thunder, I had gotten the feeling that I was involved in something more real than usual. When we were near the car, Rolling Thunder saw that it had a flat tire. He seemed not surprised at all. "Okay, now, this tire's flat, so we'll take it off. Doug and I'll wait here, Mala, while you go into Elko with the guy who's coming here." Neither the words nor the tone of voice fit the situation. The tire was flat. There was no spare. There was not a car on the highway, and it was nearly sunset. We jacked up the car and removed the wheel. The moment the tire was off, a car came speeding by, a new hardtop convertible driven by a young man. He screeched to a halt, turned around, and pulled up beside us. He knew Rolling Thunder and Spotted Eagle. "Come on, Mala," said the man. "I'll take you in with that." Then he looked at Rolling Thunder. "Mr. Pope, I can get you some real good rebuilds, cheap." "Good. I'll look into that. Be back pretty quick with this." Spotted Eagle got inside with the tire and the car sped off toward Elko. Rolling Thunder looked at me and smiled. That was the tire man from the gas station. While Spotted Eagle was gone, Rolling Thunder and I walked up and down the sides of the road without losing sight of the jacked car. At first I thought we were only strolling. Then he stopped to look at a plant only a few inches high with mint-like leaves. He pinched off a few leaves and put them into his mouth. I watched his face. Now, just briefly, his pain was apparent. Rolling Thunder chewed thoughtfully. Sometimes he looked at the ground, sometimes at the sky. Or he tilted his head. "I think I've found something," he said finally. We continued walking. I realized that Rolling Thunder was looking for herbs for his pain. The sun was about to set, and when that happened, Rolling Thunder would pick no more plants. His face looked pleasant and comfortable again. He was apparently relating to his pain in an unordinary way. I believe there actually was pain in his tooth or gum, and that he was aware of it, but apparently he did not consciously attend to this pain except when he wished to, as now, when he wanted to find the right herb and feel its effect. I was having my own feelings. I was being driven crazy by the mosquitoes. The same river that ran through the canyon in the hills to the southwest flowed along this highway not too far away. The mosquitoes were thick, and sunset was their feeding time. I could hardly wait for the sun to pass. Then we would go back to the car. I thought of speaking to the mosquitoes as Alice had done as she spoke to the bees. I even tried it mentally, but I could not check my irritated waving and brushing long enough to be sincere. I hoped Rolling Thunder was not seeing this, but I felt he was really only pretending not to notice. He chewed on several things as we walked along, and just as the sun was about to set, he found a group of those small minty plants. He paused over the group and then reached into his pocket. He opened his little black coin purse, took out some coins, and held them to the setting sun. I looked away. When he began to pick the plants, I turned and saw the money lying on the ground. After only a moment or so, we were headed back to the car with a little handful of plants. I thought it was odd for Rolling Thunder to hold the money to the sun. Earlier on the hill, he had used some sort of powder or grain, perhaps tobacco. Evidently, there was none of it left, so he had given the little plant family some money. The significance and symbolism of the sacrifice became clear to me. There was a sense in which the money would be useful to the plants. Plants would not use the coins, of course, but perhaps they could sense the regard that Rolling Thunder felt for them. It had been an energy exchange. Money, possessions, and the acts of giving and receiving are all powerful agents, and agents can be either good or bad. Here the coins had been a form of love. Rolling Thunder traveled in many states and at great personal expense to be involved in native matters. His home in Carlin was often an activist center, and he shared everything that he had with everyone. His phone bills, food bills, reflected the great number of people with whom he communicated and for whom he cared for, and now he looked into his coin purse for something for the plants. It made me feel good. For a brief moment, I even liked the mosquitoes. It was nearly dark when Spotted Eagle returned with the tire. We were hungry by the time, and we got back to Carlin and unloaded the herbs. We had supper together and talked until very late. Then Spotted Eagle drove me back up the mountain with my case and Rolling Thunder's sleeping bag. Anne and Richard were surprised to see me. They thought we'd be in San Francisco by this time. Well, maybe we'll get off tomorrow, I said. The next day came and went. I waited and no one came for me. It was a long day. I thought of Rolling Thunder's pain and I wished there was a telephone in the tent. The second night, Richard took me down the hill to Rolling Thunder's house. I carried the suitcase and the sleeping bag even though I knew I might be bringing them back again. It was no doubt too late to start for San Francisco now. We thought we would just drop in and see what was happening. Rolling Thunder came to the door as we pulled up. He stood in the front and talked for a moment. Buffalo Horse walked in and out a few times, stepping over Brandy, who noisily flopped his tail. Rolling Thunder seemed very preoccupied, but he looked all right, I thought to myself, studying his face in the dim light. Then I remembered that his pain would not necessarily be visible. There was something else, I felt, that occupied his attention now. I believed he wanted to be alone. Richard and I were soon on our way back up the mountain, watching the rabbits scamper as we rounded the curves in the road. The third morning, I was getting my gear together for the third time, just as the Camaro arrived as Rolling Thunder had promised. Minutes turned into hours as Spotted Eagle and I sat in the living room waiting for Rolling Thunder to come in from his house across the road. We did not see him until after lunchtime. We ate lunch together silently, and we were still silent as we sat in the living room. Rolling Thunder puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. Time continued to pass. The silence did not end until Spotted Fawn called from the kitchen about making up a shopping list for the supermarket. Suddenly, Spotted Eagle spoke up impatiently. He complained that it was taking too long to get started. He had promised his visiting friend Amy that he would give her a ride back to San Francisco, and there were many things he wanted to do there. He was tired of waiting. Rolling Thunder looked at his son before he spoke. He looked long. Then he spoke quietly. Now you know what has to be done here, so why don't you wait until those things are done? And then you can speak. You know I can't think about other things until I get my herbs and business taken care of. If you're feeling impatient, then you're where you think about time. And if you're thinking about time, you should be able to think about the order of things. Things have their order. You know there are certain things I have to do, and I can't do until I do those things first. Spotted Eagle reflected. That's right, he agreed. Rolling Thunder had mentioned herbs, so we were soon on our way once again with the tools and empty boxes. We drove back to the place where we had collected herbs 2 days before. We parked and placed about the same, but this time we walked south along the highway, down toward the river. It was late afternoon. I knew the mosquitoes would be thick there, and very hungry. I decided I would try not to be bothered, but, again, I was more than one person. Part of me said to the rest, in a rather nagging way, the mosquitoes will be thick here now. Then I started to notice them. I tried to recall those other parts of myself. I wanted to hear from that level within me that intended to remain undaunted. Rolling Thunder found some herbs that he wanted in a spot right down by the edge of the river. He did not speak about them, and I did not ask. This time he had an offering prepared in a little vinyl bag that he took from his pocket. He performed his ritual. Once again, I did not watch closely. We took only a few plants and cut away only the parts that were needed. They looked very small in the bottom of the box. Along the edge of the river, we came to a place where we couldn't pass. The bushes were thick right down by the water. We would have to either walk along the long way or else wade in the river. We started back along and then pressed through the bushes. Clouds of mosquitoes began swarming all over me. I nearly panicked. It would be horrible to make a scene here, yet I could hardly run away. I walked along trying to wave away the mosquitoes and push the bushes along at the same time. As we passed a large sage bush, I pulled off a fan-like branch to whisk at the mosquitoes. This might work better than waving my arms. We came to a stream running down from the hills, and Rolling Thunder found another herb he needed. The little bag of offering was brought out again. The ritual was repeated, and Rolling Thunder and Spotted Eagle began to gather the herb. I just stood and waved at my face and arms with the sage branch. I felt ashamed. Here was a medicine man and his apprentice, solemn and silent, obviously in a peaceful state, doing their work in a ritual manner, while I stood with a piece of sacred, purifying sage that I had taken without the slightest thought or regard, wailing it wildly in the air. But they did not even glance at me. I looked at Spotted Eagle. He was covered with mosquitoes. They walked up and down his arms and across his face, and some of them were red with blood. He apparently did not notice. I looked at Rolling Thunder. He had no mosquitoes on him. I stared hard at him. Swarms of mosquitoes hovered about him, darting back and forth, but none touched his skin. Then my attention returned to me, and I realized I was covered with mosquitoes and mosquito bites. I had stopped fanning with my piece of sage, and now I was ashamed to use it. I wondered whether to hold it or to drop it on the ground. Indecisively, I held it quietly at my side while the mosquitoes kept on with their meal. When at last we started back with our herbs, I was too miserable to be relieved. I had to get rid of the piece of sage, even though it would be wrong to throw it away. I placed it carefully on another sage bush as we reached the road. We put the herbs in the trunk and got into the car. I was itching and miserable. I could hardly control my movements. Rolling Thunder drove, and Spotted Eagle sat in the passenger seat. I rode him back, sitting sideways to allow room for my long legs. Rolling Thunder announced that he was headed into Elko for Spotted Fawn's groceries. After that, there was silence. I closed my eyes and concentrated on not scratching. If I should have to scratch each of my countless bites, I would be in a frenzy. Mosquitoes have always bothered me, but this time was the worst ever. I wondered whether I had spoiled the herb-gathering atmosphere. The mosquitoes had certainly ruined it for me. Whether Rolling Thunder and Spotted Eagle had noticed or not, I felt guilty about the way I had behaved. Between my gnawing conscience and the irritating itching, I was doubtedly miserable. On the top of all of this, my nose began bothering me. I was sniffing and my eyes were burning and watered. I hadn't a chance to mention this condition to Rolling Thunder, and it had grown worse every day. I thought it was caused by the dry grass around our camp, but just now it was coming on especially strong. It became impossible not to rub my eyes. Inside, I could feel a trace of a good mood, but my body was suffering. It was not a suffering like that of pain. It was an almost intolerable irritation. Then Rolling Thunder said, "There's a way to think about these things, so they won't be that way." Two things happened simultaneously. I had a feeling of shock. His words seemed sudden and forceful in the silence. He had directed them without taking his eyes from the road, and I knew they were for me. Even Spotted Eagle knew and politely appeared not to have heard. At the same time, I became more vividly aware of that trace of a good mood. It seemed to grow. It had been a beautiful day. I had been gathering herbs with Rolling Thunder. We would soon be having supper, and perhaps tomorrow we would start for San Francisco. My irritation, I realized, was disappearing fast. Soon the itching had stopped, and my nose was clear. I looked at myself. There was not a sign of the bites. I blinked my eyes, and they felt fine. I was amazed. I couldn't remember ever having gone through such a total transformation. It was as though hours had sped by in a moment. I didn't know whether to say anything, so I stayed silent, except for one brief exchange between Rolling Thunder and Spotted Eagle that I could not exactly hear. Not another word was spoken until we reached Elko. I felt exhilarated. I was still puzzled, but I was once again elated. We spent our time in the supermarket, filling Spotted Fawn's list and selecting items for the trip. Rolling Thunder was constantly questioning me about what I might like. He would point to things on the shelf and ask, "How about this? Don't you want some of this?" Somehow this pleased me, as it would a young child. I had an urge to buy something for him, and I was startled to ask him what he would like, but he was too busy asking me. Just as he wheeled the cart to the checkout stand, I walked back, picked up 2 gallons of pure apple juice, and checked them out through the express line. He was genuinely thankful. When we got to the house, there was a wonderful supper. In addition to the roast beef and potatoes, Spotted Fawn had prepared homemade banana bread, pickled beets and onions, and a gigantic green salad with herbs and sprouts. She thanked me for the apple juice. She thanked me twice, in fact. Rolling Thunder's was a happy place. It was not so much the cheerful round table by the cooking stove or the comfortable sofas in the sitting room as the good medicine that came from the people. At supper, Rolling Thunder pointed to the Lazy Susan's spice shelf. "This is the spices here," he said, turning it slightly, squinting at me. "This one here is the vinegar." I thought that was strange. I already knew these things. "There's plenty here," he said. "Take all you can." His kindness to me was boundless that night. After supper, he sat in his big stuffed chair with his half-circle cushion and puffed his pipe. I sat quietly beside him. At length, he took his pipe from his mouth and looked at me. "Did Alice tell you about herself and the bees?" "She sure did," I said, smiling. "She told me first thing when she got back that day." "That was something," he said. "Well, she has things to learn and things to offer, but that was something for her." He puffed again on his pipe. "There was a lesson in those bees, too, and we talked about that. I told her if some of those bees were like her, they'd be down on others for being communist or something. The bees cooperate a lot and don't compete much. The bees don't turn on one another. They don't make factions and investigate each other and trap each other and cut each other's throats. And they don't go out and join the John Birch Society. Bees don't need that kind of nonsense, and we don't need it either." Spotted Fawn brought coffee from the kitchen. I was comfortable and relaxed. I recalled how uncomfortable I had felt a few hours earlier, how suddenly and completely all that had changed. I'd been in good spirits from the moment I arrived in Shoshone country. I thought to myself, and the camping situation was beautiful and fun. But there were a few external discomforts. For the first time in my life, I had felt severe hay fever, with the symptoms of burning in the eyes and stinging in the nose, and the mosquitoes seemed an escapable problem. I recalled Rolling Thunder standing in that cloud of mosquitoes, stooping over the urds, without a mosquito on him. I glanced at him, sitting there. He was watching me through those squinting eyes. "There is a certain attitude you can have about yourself." Still squinting at me, he puffed a while on his pipe. "Mosquitoes won't bother you, might not even touch you, if you know how to maintain your good feelings. These attitudes make vibrations, and they have a smell to them. That's what keeps the mosquitoes away. You can make a smell they don't care for. One reason they put that poison in your blood is to make you nervous so the others can smell you. When the chemical works, you feel irritated. But if you don't feel irritated, the chemical isn't working. So if you do get bit, you don't have to let yourself get all swelled up and itchy." He leaned forward and pointed at me with his pipe stem. "You can control your whole situation by the smell you make, by the vibrations you make. It's not easy, that kind of control, but it's not impossible because you do it yourself. It's all done from the inside." He smoked his pipe and nodded toward the kitchen. "In the meantime, take vinegar. You can start with that. That'll start on that smell and the mosquitoes won't be so bad. Use it every meal, and in your bath too. A few tablespoons in the bathtub every time." Now I understood why Rolling Thunder had pointed out the vinegar. Again I remembered riding in the back seat of the car and feeling miserable. I had made no sign of my misery, but Rolling Thunder had sensed it. Could it have been my smell? As soon as Rolling Thunder had spoken, my condition changed completely. It was exciting to think about, yet embarrassing. A series of images passed through my head. I imagined him at the table pointing to the vinegar. He had his hat on, and I was looking at the feathers. Then he was standing in a cloud of mosquitoes, holding a glass of water to the sun, saying, "It's all done from the inside." I was still watching his hat. Then I was in the back seat of his car, still seeing the feathers. He was driving, pointing as we sped along. In the fields and on the road, on the dashboard, in the car, on the seats were herbs, vinegar, and spices. Some were growing and some were picked. Some were bottled, leaves floating in the air, and seeds, flower petals, crystals, and droplets. We passed by what was outside, but in the car things floated right along with us. Rolling Thunder indicated the abundance and variety of these things. I was only looking at Rolling Thunder's feather and feeling puzzled. He did not turn to look at me. He was smelling everything. "Can't you see what all this is?" he was saying. "Can't you see how all this works?" The best thing I could think to say was, "I guess you take in and give out whatever you want." I almost spoke aloud. I was aware then that I was sitting in the room dreaming. Yet the pictures were vivid and real. I had not tried to imagine anything. A thought process had stopped the imagery. It occurred to me that Rolling Thunder might actually have smelled my vibrations in the car, after suggesting to me the possibility of change, and somehow produced a vibration to which I had been able to respond, a complete retuning. That could account for his knowing and my sudden change, or perhaps, in Rolling Thunder's terms, it might have been the overpowering of one smell with another. I wondered if that could be possible. I wanted to find a way to ask. I looked over to where he had been sitting, but Rolling Thunder was gone. His chair was empty. I was startled, even a little frightened. There had been another time in camp when I had noticed Rolling Thunder suddenly standing by a tree. I was sure I had not seen him approach, and certain I would not have seen him if he had. The event was instantaneous and without detail. I had forgotten it when, some days later, a member of the committee began to tell me an apparently similar experience with Rolling Thunder, and then found that he could not talk about it. Now I sat looking at Rolling Thunder's chair, wondering if he had simply disappeared. This gave me a peculiar feeling. The only other possibility that I had been in a real trance. But I hadn't closed my eyes, and I felt my mind had only wandered for a few seconds. I looked around. Spotted Fawn was still sitting on the sofa, making a needlework design, looking as though nothing had happened. Spotted Eagle had gone into his room. I could hear music through the door. I considered the fact that Spotted Eagle had left the room much earlier while we were talking, and I had not exactly noticed that. I decided it might be possible for Rolling Thunder to quietly step out of the house without my seeing it at all. But that thought was equally puzzling. That would have meant he had purposely left me alone with my images. Spotted Fawn got up, put down her work, and stepped outside, pausing at the door to let her white cat inside. I sat alone in the living room. In only a moment, Spotted Fawn was back. "Mala?" she called back as she came through the door. Spotted Eagle came out of his room, smiling. "Start loading up for San Francisco. Your father is ready." That's the end of chapter 15, my friends. Quite a long chapter, but very important. Take care. Niawa.